Hey, what's going on, guys? This is Jeff or Lithos, and we have another which build should you run type of video. Now, one of the most common questions we get is, what is the best deck? And our answer is usually just, what is your meta? Because that is how Riptide works. He is an anti-meta hero. He likes to tackle specific types of metas and kind of finagle with the gem lottery a little bit. So this is an easier way for us to answer that question, is by showing you the stats, showing you where the matchups lie. I talked to a bunch of people and corresponding builds to try to gather data, even on stuff that I don't know much about, like Tunic build. And we compiled 5 different builds to kind of help you figure out. And these are the 5 most relevant builds that you can build. Say build again. Some context though. All warrior matchups are based on non-decimator builds. So the decimator build itself, and I mean committed to decimator, is a separate matchup. Sideboard decimator, not relevant. It's strictly worse. It doesn't actually work well, and honestly, I don't know why they still run it. They're better off just cutting it, to be completely clear. Each deck is evaluated based on current meta data that we have, the strongest available builds that we can infer from that data. So, for example, we believe that Jarl is going to be switching to more ice to deal with Aurora. He couldn't do that before because, in some respect, Zeno's a little less weak to it, and Enigma was basically impossible if you ran that build. There are some other matchups that became an issue as well, but for the most part, that's where we are sitting with Jarl. So we kind of put that with that build in mind specifically for this, and there's some other things, but we'll get to it whenever it comes to it. Each matchup we assume equal skill, equal knowledge, equal matchup experience, all equal between both players, and we assume that they're playing the best, most optimal version of their deck possible with access to every card possible. Results may shift as the season progresses for ProQuest. So in week 4, some of this information may actually be skewed because someone decides that they're going to, I don't know, run bingo in Aurora. 50-50 matchups are specifically matchups that we are stating require strong knowledge, and each deck has a win condition that they have to hit. If they do, then they usually win pretty handily. If they don't, it becomes very difficult for them to actually win. An example being for Azalea and us, whenever we draw Buzzsaw Trap, we usually win the game because of the value that it gives us on that turn cycle, assuming that they had a rough turn cycle, or they tried to commit hard to try to do a big attack, preferably to kill us, and then we come back with like a 3-card hand. So moving on to Aggro. Aggro is referring to the PT list that Damien run in the London Pro Tour. I talked to him and did some updates with some of the data that we had. We assumed that, honestly, the updates in the list are probably where we're going to lean before we get more information. And I had him look at this, and he gave it the seal of approval and said it looks pretty good, and that he agrees with everything here. So, starting at the top, hard to lose. These are basically your buy games. These are as long as you don't mess up, you should not lose this. Hard to lose. These are pretty standard. You've seen these time and time again. I'm not going to really go through them again. They're very easy. News and they heavily favored and not in the hard to lose because sometimes, same thing with kind of Slippy, they can just high roll and you have to play from behind. It's happened to me. I think I've lost a total of 2 games against New, and both times I just got bodied, and there was nothing I could do about it because I just didn't draw what I needed. So sometimes that just happens, so that's why I put it in the heavily favored. Slippy is kind of the same way. However, the difference between Slippy and New is, while yes, you can kind of turn off New's turn with a tar pit trap, Slippy doesn't have a choice but to let you turn it off, because New can just send a leave no witness, no go again, and you go, oh, okay, I guess tar pit doesn't work on that. Slippy goes, let me send this go again stealth card, and you go, oh, that's cool. No, Olympia is pretty straightforward. We're assuming it's the axe build and not decimator, but just regular axe build. It's not really great. You're very good into that kind of build overall. He honestly probably could be up here, but I like to give the people that play him the benefit of the doubt because I play Riptide. Dory. The only reason why Dory is right here is because while you very handily beat axes, a good player can navigate it well and sometimes can be scary. I've had that happen against me and Pat, where I almost hit fatigue, but it was very, very close. I ended up being able to pull it out, but he played very aggro into me, and it was a very good game. However, Dawnblade has a high roll potential. So their condition to win that is literally just, did I get the nuts? And you have to play like a weird behind game to catch up. So I put her there just to kind of say she's very good, but do not get cocky. Kind of the same thing with Azuri, but Azuri has slowly gotten easier and easier as time went by because of just what we have available to us and how they have had to build their deck. So, yeah. Dash, we're just assuming that you're playing Switchboard, and for the most part, you're triggering every trap. So them playing around your traps is basically just a game of chicken, and sometimes you're just okay taking 2 damage, and then their turn's done. If you don't have a trap in hand, and they just try to play that game, then okay. Mario is strictly harder than these two because, again, they can high roll you, but it's still very easy to go. But they can sometimes catch you in awkward hands because we run so many 2-blocks. It's a little rough sometimes. Same thing with Fang, but for the most part, you should be able to beat them because you outvalue them so much. And their main attacks being weapons means that Frailty actually hurts a lot. Fi, I haven't really played against Fi that much with the new Aggro variant and with their new stuff, but for the most part, it's always been just can you weather the storm? And if you can, easy. I've played against a local of mine very, very much on this build back before Hunted came out, and it always came to the wire, but it was like controlled, so I could tell if I was winning, I could tell if I was losing, and I think I've won most of the games except for like 1 or 2. Dio is kind of the same way, where she just has her weird high roll potential, but for the most part, because of Tar Pit, you're able to kind of navigate around her, and without High Octane, this matchup becomes much, much easier. And you can mess up her turn cycles a lot with your collapsing trap. So it's nice. Max is just not good, but he still has a weird like mech build that still is annoying, and he can sometimes like get through you because just it's mech and overpowers annoying sometimes with this particular type of build because you don't run enough traps into them to really like navigate it. But for the most part, it's very easy to win if they don't high roll into a mech like turn 1. Ira, the aggro one is basically free. However, the mid-range one can sometimes be awkward because you have to try to outvalue them, and their value is inherently like high. And if they navigate it correctly, then you have a hard time getting good value out of your traps. So that's why we put them there. Kasai is kind of in the same boat where you should do very good against them, but they have their win condition of the gold companions. And if they are able to high roll and present those, then it gets rough. Brute. It's pretty self-explanatory why it's here. It's brute life. Sometimes they just brute life you. Syndra is much easier to navigate than most of the aggro builds, and I'll go over that a little bit later. So we're just going to go ahead and skip these two just because information is later. Levia is kind of the same thing, but without her having Art of War, she becomes much, much more, 2-3 card hands kind of ordeal, and then some spike turns. So she becomes kind of Rhino-esque, but without Intimidate. And because our pings are able to just steal Blasphemous randomly, and if she decides to run Husk, steal Husk, it becomes a lot harder for her to beat us because she doesn't have Art of War anymore. So the 50-50 matchups, I mentioned Rhinar briefly, and the reason why Rhinar is here is because of Intimidate. Intimidate can make our hands very, very awkward, and in a deck that we're really trying to specifically block with very particular cards in our hand, he can sometimes make it difficult for us to navigate that value game easy. A lot of these things do translate over to the other builds, so that's why I'm trying to get some of it out of the way now. Vincent is kind of the same ordeal, but in the sense of sometimes you just have to navigate around her effects. And it sucks, because if she starts the tempo train, it's very hard for you to get out of it. So this matchup is basically not, did I draw the nuts, and more so, did they draw the nuts? If they don't draw the nuts, it becomes very difficult for them to actually get back ahead to be able to do something, or they have to take a bunch of damage to do it. Azalea, I've already kind of briefly explained it. It's pretty much based on Buzzsaw Trap. If you draw it, you win. If you don't, you probably lose. Prism. We've all played against Prism. We've all been high rolled by Prism. I feel like you guys kind of know what's going on here. For the most part, it's very winnable. But if they resolve timely Arc Lights, or turn 0 Library, or get some auras down, not passing is irrelevant, but if they get the Pierce Reality down, then you kind of get set on a clock where it becomes much, much harder for you to actually deal with their threats. And if they know how to play around your traps and not lose their angels, then you are in an uphill battle. Aggro against Jarl, especially Ice, if they resolve a Channel Lake Frigid, becomes really difficult to navigate. So his entire matchup is based upon how much Ice he gets, how much Frostbites you get, how many turns he gets to keep CLF, and if Oakenold resolves. And that's really that matchup. Betsy is very easy to navigate, but still kind of Guardian, so it's a little bit rough sometimes because we don't run as many traps as say Fatigue. But because traps don't count towards Overpower, you can navigate it a little bit. Florian is just, you have to try to keep pressure up for such a long time, and if you don't navigate through the turn cycles correctly, and they are able to decompose very fast, you just get screwed over. The biggest thing in this matchup is how many times you can resolve Seek and Destroy or Inertia to keep them from playing their root bounds. A lot of people like to really throw those Ravenous Rabbles out, but sometimes it's actually correct to activate Bow with that extra Rabble to send the arrow with a +1 and not let them actually get their D-react value out of it. Bravo is still Bravo. He can be navigated. You can actually do well against them based on the experience from past experience on him. But he is still a dominant Guardian, and he can be rough sometimes for the aggro variant to do much against, because if he starts rolling, he starts rolling hard. It's kind of the same thing with Desi, but dedicated Desi builds are hard to navigate if you do not have enough cards to get through the end game. It usually comes down to the last 5 cards. So if you're able to run 2 Remembrances, you should probably win this matchup. But if you can only run 0 to 1, then this matchup becomes much hairier, and it's wholly dependent on how many times you hit with Endless Arrows. It's a wizard. We're just naturally weak against wizard, but we can do a lot of damage, and he runs a lot of no blocks. So it's kind of a worse 50-50. I know that doesn't make sense, but did they roll well? They did. Okay, we can't really do much about that. Did they roll kind of mid? But did we roll well? Yep. All right, we got it. It really just comes down to the fact that they can, in fact, kill us on our turn. And yeah, it's kind of the same thing with Kano, but with Verdance, it comes down from the fact that split damage, which is really difficult to deal with sometimes. I know she usually doesn't do split damage, but whenever she is playing A smart Verdansk, when they're playing against a Riptide, will try to set up turn cycles that they do a little poke through gaining life, and then especially if they have a channel, and then try to throw a big attack, or just throw a massive arcane attack or action, and then just let you take a big hit to the face. And there's just not really much disruption you can actually do. Your disruption doesn't really affect her all that much, and her disruption is non-interactable, so there's not really much you can do about it. You can just high roll Kano. You kind of have to hope that everything lines up correctly and you play well to beat a Verdansk. Victor is just always going to be obnoxious because of how his kit works. We have to run so many pumps, so many low power cards, so many traps to be able to navigate through this matchup that his clashes are pretty much guaranteed to win almost every time. And it gets him so much value throughout the game, we just can't compete it. So if they start clashing and winning, you're probably losing. Teklo's not winnable. It might be slightly better now, but I tested it so many times back in the day for aggro, and I do not think I picked up a game. I do not think this matchup is winnable for aggro at all. And I think they've only gotten better tools than we have for the aggro variant. It's just not a great matchup in general. So, in general, you do very well versus Assassins and Warriors, as you saw in the thing. Most matchups are not really extreme wins or losses. It's a little bit more close to the center. So, you're usually very slightly favored or unfavored or close to even. So, that becomes a very safe pick. This deck is very safe when you don't know what the meta is, or you can at least kind of narrow it down to a certain decks. But it doesn't have too many decks that it just auto wins into. You have to fight for all of them. It's particularly strong into Syndra and Aura thanks to the fact that you do still have high damage and you still have your solid defense build or your defense tools. The kit does help you keep your hand full, especially with the Beckoner boots. If you haven't seen those, the entire point behind them is the fact that you can block a breakpoint, and then later, after you give them either a frailty or in combination with your arms, you can full block while keeping a card in hand, their weapon. That's really all it's there for, and it actually does a lot more than you think. Plus we have our Spell Void Quiver, which allows us to navigate around their sigils, and also have an oops button to help keep us alive. The slower decks are still manageable, but they demand much deeper knowledge and careful endgame setup. They are the most major skill checks for this deck. Wizards basically rely on high rolls and maintaining pressure throughout. Your entire way to beat Kano is basically maintaining inertia and seeking destroys. If you can do that for at least a couple turns, you're probably winning, especially if they don't roll well. If they roll mid, then you're probably winning. Moving on to Fatigue. Now, as you can see, this one is pretty dramatically different. There's a lot more on the extreme side. So we'll go over a little bit more of what you see here. So here are the normal ones that you usually see, but you notice a lot of the decks that we formerly had in heavy favored aren't hard to lose, because this deck massively maximizes its warrior and assassin matchup, but it completely gives up on wizard as a whole. So you should never lose as long as you know how to play against new. Fang, because of your battering bowl and because of the way your kit works with so many traps, you get so much value in this matchup. Same for both of these. It's insane. You basically control the game through offense and defense. Slippy is just strictly easier because of all the other things I said before. Same thing with Mario. You are able to just run the game yourself. Azuri is cake, and Dory is very, very difficult to actually get low. I think in this build so far, I've only gotten to sub 21 time against Dory. Any build. Max is up here on the top because he's still sometimes scary because we can just have rough turns, but overall he's just not great. So he's still very heavily favored, but not really in the hard to lose. Same thing with Dio, you should be able to navigate and fatigue them very easily, but if they decide to do a max V and roll on your face with double boom grenades, you're not doing anything about that. You're losing. Kasai still has the companions, the allies, to be able to actually like get some damage in during the late game. So as long as you can go through and try to either get rid of those, force them to block, or otherwise control how many times they get gold. Gold control is probably the most important part of this matchup. Phi is much easier to navigate. It's just easy. Same thing with Dash. It's kind of the same as I spoke to before, but now you control the entire board state and you completely limit how much they can do with cards in their hand, especially if they're on turtle build. But even on switchboard, Levia and Brute are much more favored because you are able to navigate through those matchups easier because of all your cards are basically block. It does not really matter what they hit, with very few exceptions with like crew traps. Betsy is the same way, where you just have so many traps that you can just say, that's a funny wager, so give me my gold. Ira's still here because, again, the two builds, it's still a little rough because the midrange does have a really high value. However, you should still be, I would say, very slightly more favored as a fatigue deck if you know how to navigate through it a little bit more. Syndra, unlike Aggro, you don't really have the full aggro damage that you can send out to be able to keep them blocking. So in fatigue, you're just able to try to obviously run them out of cards, but invalidate their turn cycles. You can sometimes just take a little bit of damage and then send a big haymaker at them. Even sometimes just sending a hamstring shot at them for 6 is a lot. Jarl, because you have a much higher consistency of resources, you're able to deal with getting your traps out and blocking damage. You can get value out of them usually, and ultimately you're able to fatigue them through because while they're playing these cards to limit your potential to have a turn, they're getting rid of cards in their deck. So it becomes much easier to win because fatigue isn't really on the table for them anymore. Prism is kind of the same boat as Aggro. It's very easy to navigate, but if they go off really hard, then you can't really do much about it because you can't really afford turn cycles where you destroy auras. It's just, you can't even like go again very often. There are some cases where you can, and I feel like some of the new builds might do better, but it really depends on where she sits. Azalea is the same thing as I said before. That being said, if Azalea runs Dreadbore and they Silas into you and they Dreadbore Azalea you, you're done. You're not winning that game. It's just immediately done. Bravo is much easier because you can navigate around the Dominate, and you ultimately they have to take a lot of damage to actually do much against you, and unlike with Aggro, your stuff is higher damage density, and you tend to be able to recur a lot more stuff. Same thing against Desi, you should be able to do much better against them because you're maintaining the same amount of damage that you would do with 2 cards on Aggro with only 1 card. And you have much more traps, so you should be able to limit the amount of damage they do and punish them for extending over. Aurora does become less favorable though. Before the Armory deck came out, this matchup was, I would say 50-50, maybe 55%. It was much, much more doable. You just had to hope that they didn't really like roll very, very hard. Now that they have the Armory deck, a lot of the tools that they got into that forces the high roll to be easier. And they can even have mini high rolls, which means that it's harder for us to actually prevent them from nuking us. And Exude Confidence is still a really rough card, so if they're able to navigate around them very well, it's really hard to win. Victor becomes easier because we have around 9 to 12 sixes and a much higher density of attacks overall, but we can still easily lose to the Clash. However, the difference being is that now they are in a fatigue plan, and if they try to go aggro, you should be able to navigate around it pretty well. Because of the nature of the traps that we have, Rhinar becomes much harder, because when they roll well, for us to keep up with them, we have to take a little bit of damage, and if they roll well, they can fatigue us, or at the very sometimes just out damage us turn cycles, because our hand becomes so awkward. And in some cases it means that we can't properly get value out of our hand. It becomes much worse than fatigue when you introduce crew traps. Florian is much worse into this match because you just don't have the pressure. You're just trading back and forth until he eventually decomposes. So the hope is that eventually you're able to keep pressure enough with some of your go again stuff and able to maintain that tempo much easier through potentially getting on like trigger effects off your inertia traps and stuff like that. And really, it's an incredibly skill intensive matchup. You have to weather the storm. One of the things I learned is that your codex targets aren't actually just attacks. They are attacks that are in blue, because you want to make sure that your density near late game when they decide to go off is much higher, and you have a higher potential of getting those blues, because a single blue could mean the difference between life or death. It actually happened on stream, where we had an all red hand when they decided to go off, and we just said, oh, well, we can't live through this. But if we had a single blue, we were fine. The Vinset is, you just don't have pressure. That's really what it comes down to. You just don't have enough pressure. They can sit there and block 2-3 cards and set up. So there's not really much you can do. And then there's not really much to say about Wizards. You just don't have enough pressure to be able to do anything. The on hits don't really affect them that much. And they can take their time and try to poke you down, because for us to navigate this build correctly into all of this, we have to not run extra AD, and we just don't have the slots available to run the tech cards to be able to beat them. And even if we did, it probably wouldn't be enough, because they could just play the long game. Teklo is still kind of rough because of the fact that he does block very well, and slowing down the game is actually not a good thing. So you have to be really careful about him. If he flips, you gotta hope you can survive through that storm. If you can, you're good. If you can't, you're dead. And with a lot of traps, you can potentially do it, but it's rough. As I said, it's to maximize your warrior and assassin matchup, but it minimizes your ability to beat wizards. Guardian is easier because many on hits don't really affect you, and you can navigate the endgame more efficiently. Runeblade is tougher though, because the split damage and their on hit effects are harder to manage. Syndra is slightly favored thanks to your on hits and the value you gain from blocking. They can also actually be fatigued. Plus you have some extra tools to be able to prevent their flick knife effects. Slower decks are manageable but demand deep knowledge and careful endgame setup. They are major skill checks. Wizards rely entirely on high roll and maintaining pressure through, but you can't really do that much. Rhinar specifically becomes harder due to Intimidate, as I said before. Overall, Fatigue has a more extreme spread, but it does have to play somewhat on the gem lottery. So if you're able to assume that there's not that many wizards there, this becomes a very good deck, especially if you know there's going to be plenty of warriors and assassins. And then you just got to narrow it down from there. Midrange. So midrange is the build that we are seeing that happened from the Orc Knight, who won a PQ on Riptide here in the US. Now, this build is a little bit awkward because it ends up having a much more even spread overall, and it's much more balanced. However, its bad matchups are pretty bad in the sense of the meta split. So if you don't think that there's going to be any Aurora there, and very few Florian or Wizard, then this deck is insane because of the Syndra and just where everything else is placed. So Midrange kind of just acts like a weird in-between Aggro and Fatigue, where it's able to pivot much easier. It runs more traps than Aggro, but less than Fatigue, but it has the ability to go wider and has more buffs than Fatigue. We used to refer to it as hybrid. It's kind of the same thing, and it usually just runs Dreadbore. New because of the way that the build is designed is incredibly difficult to lose. You still are able to act like a Fatigue deck against them, which basically makes that matchup impossible to lose. One of the big things that this deck has the capability of doing is just taking off a turn and then coming back with a big spike. Fang is pretty much the same as Fatigue because of the fact that you're able to just trigger everything and send big numbers, and everything gets value for you in that matchup. And stuff like Battering Bolt basically auto wins this matchup sometimes. Fi and Syndra are easy to navigate because you can do that switch between defensive and then bide your time until you got a good hand or a good spot and then burst. Same with Syndra, and the way that this deck is designed, I'll get a little bit more into it later, but it's hard targeting Syndra. These you pretty much know about. Because of the way that the deck's built around Syndra, it also ends up gaining a huge percent into Ira. And unlike Fatigue, it has a little bit more ability to play the defensive plan on top of being able to clear the win condition that Kasai has. Dory is still good, still very good, but because you don't have the higher density of traps, you're not able to really play that reaction game with her too much, as much as you would like to. Because you're able to go aggro, dash becomes easier because you don't have to play behind which build is it. And if they decide to bring Turtle, you can just go, okay, we're going to play a little bit more of an aggressive plan and burn you through resources. And if they play aggro, you can Turtle up and then still win. So it gives you so much flexibility that between both builds, your average percent goes up. Same thing with Dio, you're just able to deal with them. It's the same reason why Fatigue is able to deal with them. You'll see there's a lot of similarities between them. I'm not really going to talk about Max. Azuri, it's an assassin, but the things that this deck loses is it has to focus really hard on certain things and it has to give up certain things. So because of Marionette and Slippy and the way that the kit works, you can't really navigate around them as easily as Fatigue would, and you don't have as much damage as Aggro does. There's a little bit of an expert on it later. I'll get into that later. Prism, because you're able to keep pressure and still get through their blocks and be able to actually navigate their dominate turns with Herald of Erudition, you can pretty easily do stuff against this hero. And in addition, you have enough go again to still be able to actually attack and then clear an aura if you really need to. Brute is still Brute. It's the same reason why it's here as before. Because the deck has a little bit more resources, it's able to navigate around him, and unlike Fatigue, it doesn't have a whole bunch of traps bogging it down, so it can sideboard well. So that's why you end up seeing Wizard just a little bit better, and particularly him because he can be blocked through regular physical damage. Same thing that we talked about with Aggro with Rhinar, where he is rough sometimes because he can make your hand awkward, but because you're not so reliant on your hand being very, very optimal, and you can just kind of navigate around it pretty easily, you're not really dealing with the intimidate part as much. You're still able to keep pressure on Vincent, which means she can't try to play the long game, but you still have enough resources to be able to actually navigate through her burst turns. So that's kind of why she's there. Azalea is the same thing as always. Guardian is still a little bit rough because you lack the hyper aggro or the hyper fatigue aspects to be able to deal with them properly. They become easier than aggro though because you still have extra tools and extra resources in Jarl's case to deal with them. Same thing with Decimator. You have just more density in the deck to be able to deal with them. We'll talk about Aurora a little bit more later because there's some text there, but she ends up losing percent because of the focus that you have on Syndra with this type of build. And it's a little harder to actually put in tools to be able to deal with her because it's more of a kit thing than it is actual specific cards. Florian, you end up losing percent into versus aggro because it ends up becoming more fatigued. So you end up having the long game pressure problem. Because the reason why aggro does better into it is because it speeds the game up, but midrange only speeds it up a little bit. So it's easier than fatigue in my opinion, but it's still not great because you can fumble pretty easily. I've pretty much already talked about them, and I've talked about Guardian. Teklo is still hanging down there as always. So we'll move on. Overall, midrange is a significantly more balanced spread, as in it's able to navigate around its matchups a lot easier because you have a lot less on the extreme side and a little bit more on the middle line, as well as being able to push stuff at the hard top. The deck is way more flexible because it's not really pushing certain matchups that require like a bunch of traps, but also matchups that require a bunch of non-attack actions. You're able to run a few more tools that aren't traps than fatigue, but a bit more traps than aggro, if that makes sense. You're able to customize your sideboard more. It's a better choice in a more unknown meta when you have an idea of who your regulars are playing, but you don't know most of the field. So you can kind of target what you think is the best deck, but it doesn't do bad in it. It just requires more knowledge. You lose percent to Marionette and Slippy since it does require you to hit certain traps to have good turns. Those decks can be greedy, and you can't really punish them as easy. New, however, is targeted very specifically, making her an auto-win because of how the deck navigates, especially stuff like Battering Bolt, which doesn't really affect Marionette and Slippy nearly as much. Chi is a hell of a drug. Syndra is slightly favored thanks to your on-hits, or it's significantly favored thanks to your on-hits and the way that you deal with her pings with the bastions. I'll fix that later. The flexibility it has to be able to deal damage and block when needed aids a lot in navigating this matchup. However, you lack the meaningful disruption very specifically against Aurora because of what stuff you put into your sideboard. It becomes a matter of keeping up with damage and stealing a turn by drawing collapsing. But because I have Face Purgatory, you can't really play your turn sequence as much as you would like to, because with Fatigue, you're just sending one attack. With Aggro, you're usually sending one attack, or you're able to navigate around your New Horizons. This deck doesn't have New Horizons, because it needs to try to keep its hand and its pressure consistent. So, overall, Aggro is the best deck for a completely unknown meta. This deck is, on average, better for an unknown meta, but you know some of the people going. AIM. So, unfortunately, AIM is one of the decks that I know a little bit less about, but I was able to talk to Tally a lot about some of these things, and I'm able to help a little bit on how some of these matchups work. So, because you have a much higher density of 3 blocks, and still have plenty of traps, and you still run Dreadbore, you're able to keep your Assassin matchup much higher, and you're able to do end-game dominate effects with your line it ups and your arms, while also activating additional effects. So you're able to really like push the end game more than Fatigue can. While Fatigue is able to just overall consistently deal with the whole game, Aim is able to finish the game easier. Same thing with Kasai, you're able to actually deal relevant disruption, and you can actually potentially snipe the effects that actually hurt. So the gold generation or the gold payoff. Your brute matchup gets overall better because you can block better. You're able to do some instant speed shenanigans. It's just much more efficient with the way your hands work. Katsu, though, does become a little bit harder because you need to keep more of your hand to do stuff. So sometimes you're not really able to send an attack back with Katsu. Same thing with Fang. Sometimes you just have to take a little bit of damage to do stuff. Overall, you're still very good into them, but sometimes they can roll pretty high. I'm going to skip through Phi. Slippy is much more aggro, so it's the same issue where, like, if you're running the fight against Slippy, you're having to either race them, which is much harder, or just deal with their threats and try to block out, which can be rough because of reactions. They run a much higher consistency of reactions than some of the other decks. Their stuff is a little bit more face value. Azalea does become better, though, because your on-hits really hurt. So if you take tempo, you're probably keeping tempo. It's really tough for her sometimes. Skipping down, we'll not really talk about Reinar. Betsy is better because of the same ways that Fatigue is and Midrange is. Syndra is better because, again, with like Azalea, your on-hits just hurt really hard. So you're able to really push through whenever you have a good hand, take a little bit of damage, and then force tempo really hard, because then you can just send these on hits that really hurt back to back. Stuff like Deadeye and just your entire kit really forces them to just think about their turn cycles. Even Stone Rain really makes their turn cycle rough. Ira is kind of in the same boat as most of the other builds, where it's just harder to navigate sometimes. Vincent, because of the disruption on hits that you have, you can actually make her turn irrelevant if you get certain on hits. So, like Deadeye, you can just steal the Rune Gate card, and if they don't have a card already set up, they just can't do a turn. And because of your dominate effects, you can actually force them in the position where their turns are really awkward. And you don't go slow enough for them to be able to set up. And you have enough resources to be able to deal with their rune chance. Kind of the same ordeal with Acelio. You can still block them. Their on hits really do a lot against them. And Tunic and Aurora, which is why it's better than Fatigue. But you still can get high rolled, which is why it's in the 50-50. You're just able to deal with them overall, but they can still just do a lot. Dash is down here because you have to usually keep more cards in hand, and you don't really have as much damage, and in some respect, the on-hits can sometimes just not matter. Sometimes they just don't care, and they'll just, especially if they're on pistol build, they just don't care about the on-hits, or they'll just block it out, or they have a bunch of extra armor depending on how many Evas they run, and D-Reacts that they run. And if you're not running Dreadbore, then their D-Reacts are much more efficient. If they are running Dreadbore, then if you are running it, then like you don't really have a lot of good on hits anymore. Prism is kind of the same boat. However, it's a little bit hairier because of, again, the lack of ability to like do go again well. You're much more tall. So if they decide to resolve a Arclight Sentinel, it becomes much harder for you to navigate around your turn cycles, which is the case with a lot of decks, but very specifically him, because he will end up wasting a Deadeye and then the opponent goes, in response, Arclight, and you go, there's one Dead-Eyed gone. That would have been really great to send. So you just have to be careful into that matchup. Bravo is easier than... Most of the Guardians are easier than normal, but they are massive skill checks. I can go over a little bit more later. Decimator is in the same boat, but it really depends on draws and depends on how you navigate through things. You can run out of resources pretty quickly because your 3 blocks don't actually block 3 anymore. So now you're just running a bunch of 2 blocks, and it can be hairy sometimes, especially when you want to try to keep your full hand. So if they send just the attack for 4 and you're at 1, your turn can't really function. Not really going to talk about Victor. Florian becomes harder to navigate because if you run Dreadbore, you don't have on hits. If you run aim, they can use their D-Reacts. So it becomes a really weird catch-22. Kind of the same thing with Verdance, but Verdance also still has on hits through their arcane damage, plus the other non-interactable disruptions. Mind Warp is really rough, and sometimes because you have to keep cards in hand, they can just really mess up your turn cycles. Kano is pretty much unwinnable. You can't keep pressure enough. They can empty their hand, so your on hits don't really matter. And even though you have more resources, you're not able to keep the pressure because your on hits don't do the same thing as Aggro's on hits do. It's just more of a very specific thing. And there's Tekla. So it has a slightly higher win curve, as you can see. However, but it demands more skill and knowledge and has a much higher chance of breaking because you now have to navigate around trying to get aim counters. And if you just get a handful of arrows, normally Fatigue can just block with 2 cards and then still send an attack for a decent amount number with an on hit because of how it's built. However, if you only have attacks and no non-attack actions and no traps, you can't get the card face down in Arsenal to give it an aim counter. So you just have raw damage. You need to be able to master multiple playlines for different matchups, and it has much less flexibility to focus on specific decks, and it really has to take just a general package that it runs main board that hopefully targets certain matchups. But then as a result, it usually ends up giving up certain other matchups. And in some cases, when you run Dreadbore, it's irrelevant. It's just raw damage. It struggles more against slower decks because it requires Dreadbore because of what I was talking about. It's strong in a Syndra and 50-50 in Aurora due to just the kit and how it works. However, Florian becomes harder because of the disruption, and like I said before, it limits your options because you have to run Dreadbore. Guardian is a massive skill check in both pitch stacking and card advantage, requiring very precise blocking. Their armor and weapon makes it much more complex, so being able to navigate through that correctly, keeping cards in hand, keeping key cards to get a big dominate effect through, to be able to strip the resources and keep them from being able to swing back, is so important. So this is one of the cases where you're actually actively pitch stacking and crafting your deck way more than any other deck. So the Guardian matchup, while can be favored for, say, Tally, because he has so much knowledge into the matchup, for anyone that doesn't have that knowledge, it's way harder. Moving on to Tunic Aim. Now, we're starting at the notes here because this is the build that I know the least amount. I talked to Trade Federations, you may have seen him in the Discord, but I talked to him a lot about all this information that I could gather so that I could give you guys as much background information as I could. And he checked through the spread and helped me put it together so that way it's also as correct as possible. So you know that this information comes direct from the source of the people that make the build. The deck naturally loses a huge amount of flexibility while running Tunic over Trench. It makes the arsenal management so incredibly important, and it requires a lot more practice overall to play. The cost of that is that you are unable to run less traps overall. So certain matchups like Assassin and Warrior become strictly more difficult because you don't have these specific tools to be able to deal with them. However, the trade-off is it gains more spike turns that they can swing the tide, Riptide, and be able to actually keep or gain tempo back more than some of the other builds do. The matchup spread becomes much more even, but less top-heavy. It's a less reliant on gem lottery, and you're more likely to have a shot in pretty much each matchup. So, as a result, it's safer to pick if you are an experienced Riptide player. But it does have very specific matchups that it loses to, so you got to be careful that you don't get too cocky or that you don't have too many of these matchups there, because then you're much higher likelihood of losing out. Running less traps sometimes against like Marionette and Slippy, you can just take a huge chunk of damage. Because you don't have the reactions, you can't stop things as much, and you can't try to gain value off of your blocks when you have to block out. There's just not much you can really do about it. If they're running heavy D-reacts, then you're also constantly juggling between survival and avoiding fatigue. Aurora becomes much easier with Tunic, or at least on par with Aggro, because of kind of the similar situation. You are running a card that basically allows you to, every 3 turns, maintain at least a card in hand, or 2 cards in hand, and put much more pressure on than Aggro, because they can only do that once or twice. Now, it works for Aggro, however, this build has it more consistently, so it's a more consistent, decent matchup, is a way to put it. With Tunic and having fewer traps, you can focus more specifically on other matchups, pushing them up a tier, because you're able to run more attacks that actually impact against certain matchups, so like Sleep Dart or something like that. And you can also run more freely stuff like Remembrance to deal with some of the slower decks. However, in an ironic twist, all Riptide builds are horrendous matchups for Tunic game. Fatigue and Midrange easily outblock through all Dominate effects, and because of the cost of not having Barbed, when you run Dreadbore, it's still not great. And Aggro just does too much damage for the deck to really be able to keep a huge amount of cards in hand. This deck just struggles to dodge Disruption from Riptide. So moving on to the spread, as you can see, it's a little bit more centered into these 4 tiers. While it does have a heavier bottom than top, it does have much more of a balanced approach. Now, if you look at the top, Kasai is much higher up here. It's because you still have the Disruption, but because of the spike turns, you're able to more frequently try to get rid of their gold generation or try to get rid of the gold payoffs randomly throughout the game. So that makes this matchup significantly easier, which is kind of ironic because some of the other warriors go down. And we'll get to that in a second. Ira goes up significantly because of those spike turns, and you're able to still block damage, but also kind of keep a good amount of pressure back, which it really ends up being a back and forth most of the time. Katsu, because you have the lack of traps, it's a little bit harder to deal with his searching and being able to actually keep pressure sometimes. But overall, it's still not great since it's lost all the tools, so I wouldn't really put too much worry into Katsu. Fang, even though you are losing a lot of traps to be able to deal with a lot of his stuff, you're gaining a more consistent way to do Disruption. And your spikes do keep your tempo at least every other few turns. Same thing with Dory. You're still able to push them to block with cards, and then once you have tempo, you can tank damage and then steal tempo, and then keep pushing harder and harder. And then when you potentially they take damage and you lose it, then you still have traps to be able to try to minimize what they can do. So it's still very decent. Same thing with Azuri. You're able to easily navigate through her disruption because it's not. It's very straightforward, or just sometimes raw damage. So it's not as huge a deal as some of the other assassins. Going down, Fi is just overall easier because compared to some of the other builds, like I said, the spike turns. It's really what it comes down to for a lot of these. We're just going to go down a little bit. Brute is still Brute. Just going to leave him there. Prism, spike turns allow you to actually push through huge chunks of damage sometimes and limit the turns that they can do. However, it is still Prism, and I want to note that it is still kind of rough. And if they get rolling through with a Herald and you're unable to block it because you don't have the traps, it can get out of hand. So I would say that this is like better, but harder to get back from behind. New and Slippy and Arachne Marionette. We've already talked about these three, so we'll just go ahead and skip them for now, but you know they're right here. But New is kind of in the same boat where they just end up fatiguing you easier because you can't navigate around your arsenal. And like with Dreadbore, you kind of just don't really have on hits if you run it into that matchup. And if you don't run into that matchup, then they get a huge value out of it. So it's a huge amount of catch-22 situations where they can easily take the game from you because you can just lose your arsenal, lose value, and then get fatigued through the late game if they have CYB especially. I would say CYB is probably harder to deal with and much further down than just aggro, mid-rangey, whatever you want to call that build. It doesn't really run in CYB, but it runs Sigil and it runs DX. Dio can just high roll you, and you don't really have much to do with that because, like I keep saying, you don't have the traps. So sometimes it just becomes difficult for you to deal with because you don't get value per turn cycle. You have to keep your hand more frequently. So sometimes they can just high roll you. That's really why this is there. Vinset, kind of the same with the mid range, where you do in the regular game, you do still have a actually decent amount of ability to navigate through their turns, but you're still playing their game, so it's still kind of rough. Aselio, it's similar to some of the other ones that put him at 50-50. Syndra is overall good because of similar to the regular aim build. It's just better overall because you have more consistently turns to be able to spike them, but you do get less value overall on defense. Azalea is Azalea. Jarl is, can't really speak too much about that matchup. I don't really know enough. Victor overall is better because, again, spike turns, and we've already kind of briefly talked about the wizards. And guys, I've tried. Rhinar is still how Rhinar works, and Dash is just harder because your spike turns don't matter too much against them because you're probably not running Dreadbore into them. So if they're playing a turtle build, it's really tough. And I think I've seen a lot of them run CYB. Naturally, this deck does a little bit worse into CYB. And I think Dash in particular does a lot of damage and high roll potential, and you don't have as much value on the defense. And even if they run the type of play pattern behind running switchboard and running pistols into you, it's just, you can't really take advantage of that. You can't punish them for trying to go wider and not punish them because you can't put those traps in arsenal and try to buy yourself or like get value on the next turn. You have to say, okay, well, I have to play this, not get value, or not play it, get hit, and then keep this card in hand or pitch it. Betsy is really much tougher. I don't really know why I didn't ask him, but it's not too relevant in a matchup. He explained that Florian, in general, he thinks for all builds is pretty rough. And I would assume that Tunic aim is a lot harder because you have to find other ways to get the rune chant, like prevention with AB. But I think sometimes they run Trench, so if they still have Trench, this matchup probably goes a little bit higher. But if they don't have room for Trench and they just cut it completely, then it's sitting right about where it is. He was telling me something that these 4 are unwinnable. He said something about Bravo CYB that he thinks is incredibly difficult and almost unwinnable. It's a little bit higher on there in compared to the other ones, but he specifically said it was better than Riptide. So, Decimator, I guess, is kind of in the same spot of it's just you don't get value out of your blocks anymore. All your stuff blocks for 2. So those 0 for 4s that you have that you try to get huge amounts of value out of in other matchups becomes 2. So, and you can't punish them for pushing harder with some traps like some of the other decks can. It's just tough. And again, it's the whole Dreadbore argument. So if you run Dreadbore, you don't have many on hits. So I did what I could to try to give you information on all these builds. I know some of the information may become not accurate after this weekend in the entirety. I will try my best to answer questions if things change, or to maybe post an update or put something in the comments. Moving on into a little bit more of a juicy one that I actually really liked, and it was interesting to look at this and put this together. So this is Riptide mirror spreads. So obviously the mirror matches of fatigue is 50-50 because that's how that works. But I put together this so that you can see if you go against a Riptide where your percentages lie. And if you know there are other Riptides there, you know if you're running Tunic aim, that's a bad matchup. But you know if you're running, say, Aggro, that your bad matchup is Midrange and your even one is aim. You can kind of see, more green, more favored. More red, less favored. Gray, even. Pretty straightforward. I appreciate you guys joining me, and I know this is a lot of information and a lot of things that you may need to already know. Some people might disagree with me. I tried to do as much as I could to keep myself from being biased, because even I kind of disagree with my own spread for Aggro, but I understand that a lot of them are biased. So I would actually put, for Aggro, Guardians lower, because I struggle in that matchup. But I barely lose to Illusionist, so I put Prism at almost close to heavily favored. But I'm so biased on that because of how I play the deck into the certain matchups, that I think that I have to understand that, and I have to try to take this away and consult other people. So that's why I try to get as much information together from other sources and try to use basic reasoning skills to know, okay, this matchup is realistically here for someone else. And yeah, that's how this all got put together. All the decks and the corresponding people that helped me out for the particular builds are in the description. I wanted to also showcase our first end screen, which is ironically through the PowerPoint. It was just easier to do it that way. But these are our current patrons. They get a little end screen thing where they can decide what they want to put for their name, their bounty, for Riptide's ledger, and why. So for example, Apricute, which you've seen in the Discord probably, he is a nighttime menace, and he decided to play drums in the hospital district very poorly. People did not like him for that. He's wanted. Thanks for joining me, and check out all the people in the description and give them a shout and be like, hey, I heard you have this cool build.